comrades. Now, I think I've seen the worst Chomsky video ever. I'm not the biggest fan of Noam Chomsky. I mean, I know that he is supposedly a respectable, I don't know, intellectual leftist. Yeah, like, okay, occasionally he says something about US foreign policy or about something similar, which makes sense, but he's insanely popular. I don't understand why. I mean, well, I mean, I guess that kind of stuff just is popular, but it just doesn't make any sense to me. He isn't in any way exceptional. His critique on Slavoj Žižek was basically just idiotic. He was, I mean, and I'm not even the biggest defender of Žižek. I'm just saying that Chomsky's entire criticism was like, oh, I don't like him. It was basically just, he was being butthurt and jealous of Žižek's, you know, sudden popularity, and that's pretty much it. But anyway, let's get to this video. It's called Noam Chomsky, Marxism versus Leninism, and it's fucking incredible.
In the mid-70s, many people in the West thought that Marxism had a reasonable case to argue, but
I mean, I know that when you see a video like this, it already sounds bad, but this is way worse than you would ever imagine. I mean, it's so strange.
In the mid-1980s, many of them no longer considered that it had. What exactly happened? Did it turn out that it was all just a big joke?
Well, I think what happened is what you brought up before. Marxism was associated with the Soviet Union and Maoist China and other so-called communist systems. But, you know, Marx would have turned over in his grave to see what they were doing.
Oh, blah, blah, blah. Like, yeah, I mean, we can have this conversation if you want to talk about, I mean, in my opinion, there's a vast difference between the Soviet Union in the 20s, in the 30s, 40s, compared to, let's say, the 80s. There's a vast difference, but I don't think that if Marx was alive, I think he would probably have a criticism of the 1980s Soviet Union, but he wouldn't just totally denounce it, I don't think. Even though, I mean, I think that the 80s Soviet Union was revisionist, even I wouldn't totally denounce it as being like all bad. I think they had some issues, but, you know, that's reality.
They were radically anti-Marxist.
Well, maybe, I mean, they were definitely anti-Stalin, and in some instances they were anti-Lenin in some respects, but anti-Marxist. Well, I mean, they had some theories that would be considered anti-Marxist and all that, but okay, fine, whatever.
Radically. But as long, like take, say, the way the Bolsheviks, Lenin and Trotsky, decided they had to drive the backward peasantry to industrialization by force.
What are you talking about? What are you talking about? I mean, don't you think that happened in the 30s, and like with Stalin and everything, not with Lenin and Trotsky? What?
In order to lead ultimately to a socialist society.
Besides, wouldn't you? Well, yeah, actually, I was gonna say, wouldn't you still have to agree that that's what needs to happen? But I'm pretty sure he actually says that no, that's not necessary.
In the last 20 or 30 years of his life, Marx was working on peasant society in Russia. There were the Narodniks, you know, the urban intellectuals went out to the countryside to collect information.
Yeah, this is so fucking weird. I mean, I've never heard anyone defend the Narodniks as a viable way of doing things, but now there is somebody, because Chomsky just did. What the fuck have you been smoking? Okay, now, because this is the strangest argument I've ever heard. Because typically, all the dogmatic Marxists and the so-called orthodox Marxists and the Mensheviks, they always said that the Bolsheviks' biggest mistake was that they tried to have a peasant revolution. Because they had so many peasants and they tried to utilize the peasants for the revolution, that was their big mistake. That instead they should have just waited for capitalism to develop and then do the revolution like when the peasantry is already, gone and there's just the industrial proletariat. Now, of course, that's a stupid argument, and I have pointed out on multiple occasions that actually sometimes Marx talked about the peasantry. Completely like undeniable that Marx spent like 95% of his time talking about the industrial proletariat. And if you asked Marx where was the revolution going to happen, he would have said, in an industrialized country, which is perfectly reasonable considering his context. And even in his own lifetime, the revolution did happen in an industrialized country. It happened in France. There was the Paris Commune. That said, Engels wrote the peasant war in Germany. I think Marx collaborated with him, and then they wrote the peasant question in France and Germany. But those were both, those were pretty short things. But basically what Chomsky is going to say next is he's going to point out what Marx and Engels said in the preface of the second Russian edition of the Communist Manifesto. And in that, and I've actually quoted that before in some video, I can't remember which video that was, but basically Marx says that, hey look, there's these communes in the Russian countryside. Maybe the peasantry has some potential here, so if we combine the peasant movement somehow with the proletarian movement in other countries, then maybe the revolution could even begin in Russia. But yeah, that's what they said back in the day. So yes, Marx clearly wasn't totally opposed to the idea of a peasant revolution, but he clearly didn't think that was what was going to happen.
Figure out how the peasants are living, so on and so forth, try to assist them in things. And they collected tons of data, and Marx was just poring over the data. And he became convinced that there's real revolutionary potential in peasant society, peasant communes, peasant cooperative tradition, and so on. The urban socialists, both the Bolsheviks and the Social Democrats, literally suppressed all that work.
Now, this is total bullshit. He's now arguing, he's literally arguing that Marx was a Narodnik. Narodniks, they had this very romantic view, utopian view of the past. They thought that during the Middle Ages, in the so-called peasant communes, they just had a great old time, that they just need to go back to that. They said we need to stop all this industrial development that was happening in Russia in the early 1900s, that they need to stop all that industrial development, and they need to stop the development of capitalism. You could just do that, which you can't, of course. They couldn't do that. Basically, what exactly did the Narodniks do? Their strategy was that they could just kill some Tsarist officials, and then they could coerce the government to do something, which didn't work. They were crushed eventually. They were basically a small group of individuals, not really connected to the masses at all, and they tried to do these attacks against the government. And in fact, Lenin's older brother was also a Narodnik, who was executed for trying to, I don't remember if it was for trying to murder the Tsar or if it was for planning to murder the Tsar, but in any case he was executed by hanging. So that's what they tried to do. Now, when you skip forward a bit to the era of, Lenin and stuff, Lenin's biggest criticism of Narodnik ideas was, first of all, that they opposed development. They wanted to go back to feudalism, which is stupid. that's totally anti-Marxist. There's no way Marx would have supported that. The biggest thing that the Narodniks were focused on in the early 1900s was trying to prove that capitalism wasn't developing in the countryside. That was what they were trying to do. They were like, they had all these figures, like Chomsky says, they had all this data, and they were trying to twist the data so that it would show that there's actually not capitalism in the countryside, and that they were trying to minimize the inequalities and all that, because they would say that, you know, we allocate all this land so that everybody gets some land, even though it was allocated based on who has the biggest family and who has the most horses. So the kulaks would basically get most of the land, because the idea is, you know, the idea was good, basically, that if you're a small family and you don't have any horses, well, you can't till that much soil, so you can't, you know, you don't get that much land. Okay, makes sense, but then it's easy to see a problem with that, because the kulaks, they buy all the horses, so now they get all the allotment land for free, and then they can also rent land from other people and even buy land. So the kulaks would buy land from peasants who couldn't properly use their own land because they didn't have horses and they didn't have tools and whatnot, so or they might have to work in some other place, so the kulaks would just buy some of their land. Eventually those workers wouldn't make enough money because they didn't have so much land, they couldn't till it, whatnot, so they had to basically start working for the kulaks. So the kulaks would start hiring people, and some of Lenin's earliest work is, you know, about these things, the new economic developments in peasant life, and what are the friends of the people and why they fight the social democrats, development of capitalism in Russia. Those books, they're about this very thing, and they were basically proving that look, the peasantry is being divided into two sections. There's the exploiter peasants, and then there's the semi-proletarian peasants. The semi-proletarians who own very little land or don't own any land and have to look for employment elsewhere. And then there's the exploiter peasants, the kulaks, who are becoming more and more capitalistic and all that.
It was just too inconsistent with their own class interests.
No, that's stupid. I mean, why on earth would the Bolsheviks be opposed to a peasant revolution?
Of, you know, controlling social movements. So that was gone. But and the same is true across the board. I mean, I'm not, again, kind of like Adam Smith. You can't worship Marx, but he had things to say, and what he had to say, what he believed, was utterly inconsistent with what are called the communist socialist movements.
This is so fucking stupid. I mean, I've never heard anyone argue this before. I've never heard anyone support Narodism, and I've never heard anyone say that the Bolsheviks were anti-peasant and that's their problem. Are you out of your mind? I mean, the Mensheviks, who were the enemies of the Bolsheviks, they were saying, no, like Russia is too backward and we're an agrarian country, therefore we must wait for capitalism to develop, and then we will take power, and then we will have the revolution. The Bolsheviks were saying, you know, okay, Russia is an agrarian country, but we should still take power and we should still build socialism. Are you next you're probably going to say that Mao was anti-peasant revolution. I mean, you don't think that the Bolshevik revolution was a peasant revolution? Most of the country was peasants. So what exactly was it then?
Even more the communist than the social democratic ones.
I mean, I still can't wrap my head around this. He is claiming that Marx was all about the peasants, but Lenin wasn't. Have you ever heard a stranger thing in your entire life? Like, if you even, like, read some early Lenin, like, read some of the Bolsheviks emerged, like, in 1903, 1904. That's when the party first split. And the Bolsheviks were already saying that they support the peasantry in basically just taking the landlord's land. Just taking it. The Bolsheviks supported that. they supported rural Red Guards. I mean, clearly they were in favor of peasant revolution. They were basically the only Marxist group to be involved in the peasant movements. The Mensheviks opposed it.
In any event, once you associate Marx with Russia, and it's clear that Russia is becoming a disaster, as was becoming clear by the 80s, well, of course, then you have to say, let's give up Marx. And I think that's essentially what happened.
But this is such a... I'm speechless, I just can't say anything. Basically, my question is this, I mean, how can anybody take this guy seriously when he's literally saying that Marx was pro-peasant revolution, but Lenin wasn't, that the Bolsheviks weren't? Okay, fine, whatever, but how can anybody take this guy seriously? Also, before I go, I want to give shoutouts to some people. So, two friends of mine recently started a channel together. It's called the Hammer and Sickle. It's pretty good. Go check it out. I'll put the link in the description. Also, Black Cat, Marxist and anarchist. He used to be an anarchist, but now he's a Marxist. I think he's a Maoist. Check out his channel. I'll put the link in the description for that as well. And then the Voice of Communism. That's also a newer channel that I discovered, and I've been watching that. So yeah, go check them out. Go support Marxism.